Welcome to the Island Lecture Series, everyone. This is a program of the Institute of Island Studies which has been running since the 80s. And we want to thank you all for coming out on this windy, rainy, blistery evening. As we gather, it's important to acknowledge that as attendees, presenters, organizers, we are learning, meeting, and living on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I hope that everyone here today and everyone who listens to the recording later will consider how we can, in our own ways, actively honor and uphold our obligations as treaty people. The Mi'kmaq people signed the Peace and Friendship Treaty starting in 1725. My name is Pooja Kumar. I'm the coordinator of the Institute of Island Studies. And the Institute's offices are based just down the hallway on the way to the washrooms, which some of you have already encountered. You can learn more about what we do on our website, www.islandstudies.com. We have a monthly newsletter. If you haven't been getting it, check your junk email folders or your spam folders, and you can go on our website and read that as well. There is a sign-up sheet by the door, so feel free to sign up now or when you leave. So without further housekeeping ado, I am delighted to be introducing Dr. Mike Heuvel this evening. He'll be talking about his ongoing research on water sustainability on PEI. Mike is affiliated with the Biology and Biomedical Sciences divisions and departments at UPEI, and he's a former Canada Research Chair in Watershed Ecological Integrity. If you're not familiar with Mike's work, which I'm guessing some of you are, on the Island Studies website, you can go to a symposia page and look at his past work at our 2014 and 2016 symposia, which are bigger events. I'll hand it over to Mike now instead of spoiling anything about his talk by giving you an intro. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Pooja, and thanks for coming out on this rainy night where water is probably something we have in too much of abundance for the last 10 days. So I'm going to try and give you a summary or overview of research we've been doing on environmental flows, in particular to do with taking groundwater and PEI, which of course is essential as we're 100% dependent on groundwater for all of our fresh water here. So now this dates back well over 2 decades to the Binns government when they established the moratorium, and as part of that they had made a pledge to do research into the water resources of Prince Edward Island. So, well, it didn't happen for a couple of decades, but we're certainly getting into it anyways in a fairly big way, and which I'm going to talk about some of the science aspects of this. So I've come to realize that it's almost impossible to summarize everything in a single talk, so I've kind of cherry-picked some of the parts that are most interesting to my parts of the study. So first of all, what are environmental flows? So, well, a whole bunch of scientists got together in 2007 and decided from 57 countries in Brisbane, Australia, and created a declaration to call upon governments to estimate and protect environmental flows globally. So this is known as the Brisbane Declaration of 2007, but people met again and they slightly wordsmithed it in 2017, which is this version, but it doesn't really change the content of it. So environmental flows describe the quantity, timing, and quality of freshwater flows and levels necessary to sustain aquatic ecosystems, which in turn support human cultures, economies, sustainable livelihoods, and well-being. So there's actually a lot in that little definition. So first of all, quantity, the amount of water, but it's not just important to have sufficient amount of water, it has to come at the right time. So an annual cycle of hydrology in most flowing waters, so where you have a lot of water, you have a little water at different times, things like dams can greatly change the timing of that water movement. So, and the quality of freshwater flows, well, that's quality of water. Well, that's a big one, and in fact the province of PEI has a definition of environmental flows now in the Water Act, but they left quality out of that definition because And I can see why, because that's a big kettle of fish when you start getting into quality as well. So they're just focused on the quantity and timing in their definition in the Water Act, where it is defined in PEI for the first time as environmental flows. So they not only recognize in this definition sustaining aquatic ecosystems, which is my interest and what I'm going to talk about, but they also recognize that water, of course, supports cultures, economies, livelihoods, and well-being. So there's a variety of social and cultural uses which are important, which feed into the environmental flows declaration as well. I'm not going to talk much about that aspect, but just recognize initially it's important. So this is all great, but how do we measure how much flow in a river is sufficient amount of flow? What's a safe flow? And here I'm mostly going to be talking about the aquatic component, the health of the organisms in there. So, well, there are a variety of methods and ways to do this, and the one that is almost exclusively used in environmental legislation are regulations for the Water Act. Every province's regulations, any country that has regulations are called hydrological. So what's that? Well, we basically measure how much flow or discharge in hydrological terms is in the river at a particular point in time. Just a graph here of some of the parts of Coles Creek, which I'm going to talk about, and flow in cubic meters per second over time. So there's an annual cycle where we tend to have quite low flows in the summer here, and of course flows right now are building up for obvious reasons and through the winter, and then a big freshet when the snow melts, so high flows, and going down again into the summertime. So what are safe? So hydrological method, I'll talk about that in a minute, where we simply measure the discharge and try and say, based on knowledge we have, what's a safe level of flow. We can do hydraulic methods as well, which is a form of modeling which really looks at the profile of moving water system, a river system. So what changes in the profile, the cross-sectional area of water, the wetted perimeter, when I take out a certain amount of water from that system. So. And we can put that hydraulic information together with what we know about things like fish and invertebrates and try and examine the amount of change in the amount of physical habitat for a set of target species as a function of the stream discharge. So for example, we would know how much water is going through the stream. If we reduce it by 10%, we can calculate the reduction in wetted area. But if that wetted area is not actually habitat, it's not actually relevant to those species. So if that wetted area that we're losing is actual habitat, like it might be for a brook trout that hides under the banks, it is quite relevant. So habitat simulations are based on hydraulics and flow, but they also consider the biology of the animals. And we can also use different approaches of holistic frameworks, which is really a consensus sort of approach where people sit together with experts and look at all aspects of the system, including societal, cultural, recreational, aboriginal uses of the water, and make these decisions on a more societal approach rather than just looking at the sheer science, which I've shown you in the other three approaches. But I'm going to talk about the science approaches anyway. So what do we do? As I said, the hydrology is how we mostly do this in any country just about. And how do we do that? Well, we try and summarize that discharge of the system in terms of numbers, which become our criteria for flow. So the median discharge, for example, is called Q50. So if we're measuring 70% of the median discharge, it's a 70 Q50, or Q95, 95 percentile. There are some quite strange ones as well. So it's the 7Q2, which is a 7-day, 2-year flow quartile. So these are just all statistical methods to summarize that hydrograph that I showed you, which shows discharge versus time. So they can be evaluated annually, monthly, weekly, daily. The PEI regulations, which predate the Water Act, they go back to the previous regulations. They are actually unchanged in the Water Act. Are that we must maintain 65% of the median flow in a stream for groundwater abstraction, and 70 if you're taking surface water directly from the stream. Now, what does the fish care if it's for the 5% difference? I don't know. So it's still a bafflement to me why they use two different regulations for groundwater versus surface water. In fact, the more lenient one is for groundwater because you can reduce to 65% of the median flow. And in actual fact, I believe that groundwater abstraction liter per liter has more impact on the stream because you can change the stream temperature a lot more. So this makes no sense, but for most of what we're going to be talking about is the 65Q50, which is done on a monthly basis, and that's what's used in PEI. So for the metric. So the regulation is that we should not take so much water that the streams go below the 65Q50 at any time. So. All right, let's start into the studies, and this started in 2016 with a bit of a smaller study, and it kind of mushroomed. And that study was kind of opportunistic at the time. I think Todd Dupuis was an assistant deputy minister at the time, and then he got changed to another job. Now he's an ADM again, I think, but he formerly worked for the Atlantic Salmon Federation, and was very interested in this and saw an opportunity that maybe the province could study the Miltonville well field before they actually started pumping, which was an important aspect. So they hadn't started pumping in 2016 yet. Of course, the Miltonville well field was near here, was built to relieve some of the pressure on the Winter River because they were taking so much water out of the Winter River that parts of the upper system were drying up in the summertime. So certainly by any metrics, they were so far out of compliance with any environmental flow regulations that it was absolutely essential that they take the flow off of the Winter River because they're having really severe effects. So they put 5 wells in the Miltonville well field. They started pumping. They had some trouble the first year. They kept blowing up pumps, so they'd pump for a while and stop and blow up another pump. And I guess they got it sorted, but they didn't really start pumping full on until about 2018. And this is actually the city of Charlottetown data for how much water they're pumping out of the Miltonville well field. You can see they have a discharge permit that's just over 6,000 cubic meters per day. They generally are staying below that, but they're still pumping 24/7, 365 days a year. They're pumping 5,000 cubic meters per day out of the ground for the city of Charlottetown. So it's been slightly increasing. You notice ups and downs too, which actually tend to be summer or winter ups and downs as well because there's more water demand when we had a whole lot of people to the island in the summertime. So to study this, the objective was there were already regulations on PEI. So we weren't doing anything that was going to create regulations. Our objective was to validate existing environmental flow guidelines or regulations of PEI in the context of protecting biota within the context, I just wrote this today, that's context twice, within the context of non-stationary climate. So yes, what's happening now, this is an important point, and this is found to be very generally true in environmental flows work, that we apply these hydraulic methods, but very seldom do we actually measure with actual biological organisms whether those numbers are protective in a particular place and particular time. So this has never been done for PEI before. So we're using these numbers. Are they actually protective of biota in our environment? So as you can do it. And what's going to happen when climate changes to the flow as well, which of course is always an underlying question. So Coles Creek is a moderately disturbed watershed. There is a lot of agriculture, as you can see by the beige sort of colors, but there is actually a very nice riparian zone for about 2/3 of the stream, quite nice mature riparian zone, a lot of big trees. So and it kind of turns, well, bad a little up, and there's not a lot of shading, and there's not a lot of trees above that. So it's quite disturbed in the upper headwaters, and the water gets very warm. But in fact, the water cools as you go down. It probably has one of the highest brook trout densities we've measured anywhere in the Maritimes, actually. So it really is an abundant spot for brook trout. So I'm going to talk a lot about brook trout because they are one resident native salmonid that we can study just about everywhere, and they're impervious to anything we throw at them in PEI. They just exist. I don't think I've seen a spring where they don't exist on PEI. So we did an extensive measurement on the stream, including flow measurement, which we've put in. I'll show them in a minute, but we've put in 2 stilling wells to do our flow measurement. Environment Canada has a flow station there, but they put it right in the middle of the well field, which doesn't necessarily tell us very much. In addition to that, for fish, we established 12 electrofishing reaches that we do every single year. I think we're on our 9th year, all up and down to the river to measure the stream biota. So we're mostly going to focus on fishes. We didn't have the resources to do invertebrates or anything else living or associated with the stream. It's just going to be fish for this part. So. Now, how do we ever actually measure flow? So, well, we measure water level with a pressure logger. So, and quite often we put these stilling wells into the bank. Just makes the data a bit better. We do have some sites where we've just pounded a piece of signpost in the stream and have a level logger in the stream. Tends to be much more susceptible to kind of wave action and things like that. So we put the level logger inside that pipe in the bank, and water comes in here. So there's always, so like a well, there's always a constant level in there. So, but of course that's level. That doesn't give us flow or discharge. So, well, somebody has to go out manually and measure discharge. There's no way about it. There's no instrument really that can, in a stream like that can accurately measure discharge directly. So I have an excellent technician, Christina Pater, who spends just about all her time now going out to streams and doing manual flow measurements. So with a staff and a velocity meter and measuring the flow. So every one of those points you see there is her going out to those particular streams and doing a flow measurement. So which is a lot, and that's just 1 year. That's a lot for a year. So we're able to measure the stage or level in the water versus the discharge, get a calibration curve. So now we can take all that fancy level logger data and we can convert it to flow every half hour. So, and again, I'm going to talk about the brook trout work in particular. So there are brook trout, rainbow trout, and sticklebacks in that stream. Might have seen one eel ever and about 2 salmon per year for a few years, but brook trout are ubiquitous to PEI, so we can catch them in good numbers everywhere, which is important for statistics. They're found everywhere, so we can measure them in every stream we're using. So it'd be nice to study salmon, but there's not enough salmon in Coles Creek to study them. So we electrofish every fall, the exact same reaches, the exact same parts of the river, so we can compare from year to year and see what's happening over time. So I'm just going to talk about the juvenile brook trout, which is what most of the data is going to be about, which are the young of the year. They hatch in about February, and they're in the area of 7 to 8 centimeters by late October when they finish their year of growth. We can usually catch them in very good numbers and catch them everywhere. So they've proved to be one of the best indicators, and they're fairly resident in the stream for that year. They're not traveling large distances. They haven't moved too far from where they were hatched in their first year. So I'm just going to talk about young of the year. But before that, for this project, there was a couple other exercises I'm going to talk about very quickly. And one was just to do a mathematical or statistical exercise of PEI flows and see what was the best flow metrics to use, or whether really the metrics that we're using are protective of, relatively protective. So now there's two sides of that spectrum. You can have really stringent regulations that are very, very protective of the environment. There's one problem with that is, one, nobody will ever be able to use any water because your legislation is so restrictive. The second part of that is if your regulation is so restrictive, because of the stream variability on PEI, you're going to naturally be out of compliance, even if nobody is taking water about 50% of the time, because we have such variable stream rates here. So there's a lot of things to kind of balance off with regards to that. But we're able to use historic PEI data. Environment Canada has an excellent database of hydrometric stations. You can find out what the level is in the streams of PEI real-time online right now if you want. And for all of these sites in Canada, Quebec, you'll see a whole there runs its own program to do this. So with some of the streams of PEI, we have 60 years of flow data. So we were able to do analysis of the 60 years of flow data and compare a whole bunch of metrics to see if the one we're using is good. And the reality is it's kind of middle of the road. So depending on the stream, so it's not the same all the time, and sometimes it's very, very protective, and sometimes it's a little bit less protective, and it depends on the stream. So it's not even specific for a given stream. But in general, on average, it's kind of a middle of the line measurement. So it is neither overprotective nor underprotective. So from that sense, it's okay. So I alluded to climate. This is probably the only time I'm going to talk about it here. So, but using models, we looked at a variety of scenarios for what's going to happen to climate in the future. I'm just going to focus on the August, September, which is our low flow. That's when it's most critical to animals in this. So this is a table. It's not that easy to interpret. So, but if our median flow, for example, this is on the Wilmot River, is 0.45 cubic meters per second. Under these scenarios, it's not going to change very much at all. So, in fact, in a lot of cases, based on climate models, the late summer flow in our rivers is predicted to go up, not down. So we're not going to have less flow. We're actually going to have more flow. What is probably more pertinent is that this Q95 is smaller, which means that there's more variability. You're going to get more ups and downs in flow. And this is a direct translation of the global climate models, which suggests we're going to get more variable weather or climate conditions as well. So no real big concern in terms of the amount of water for PEI. We're really very lightly affected by climate change as compared to other areas in terms of the amount of water. Rainfall is predicted to go up. So you will see a whole lot of models out there and a whole lot of predictions, and we're going to have more droughts, and we're not. We did this exercise. I wouldn't trust our own models to tell you that. So I certainly don't trust anybody else's that don't show their work to tell you that. So anybody that says we're going to have all kinds of droughts in the summer in PEI or not, I have no faith in that information whatsoever. We just don't know. So really, we're going to do a little more work on that. But we've tried to model. I'm not a modeler. We tried modeling with a modeler, and we can't even predict the variability that happens now, let alone in 100 years with these models. But also important, what's going to happen to water temperature? So I showed you that graph of the hydrometric stations in Canada. This amazing program has surprisingly never been affected by government cuts. It's really well set up, really well run across Canada. It's an amazing repository of data. In the Margaree River, they have 106 years of flow data, of discharge data from that river. So nobody ever thought to measure temperature at those stations. So here we are in an area where climate change is important. So we have no long-term water temperature records for Canada at all. So now, fortunately, we had some for a few rivers of PEI because we had some turbidity loggers that have been running for over a decade, which for a decade of continuous water temperature readings of PEI is huge. Those are the largest databases and periods that we have. So we were able to, in addition to the flow models that were done in Quebec, we were able to do a water temperature model. What's going to happen to summertime temperature in water in PEI? Almost nothing. So about half to 1 degree under the worst possible scenarios in 100 years. So very, very little. So because we're not having a huge amount of temperature change on PEI. So now what is not shown here, which is far more concerning, everybody focuses on it's going to be so hot, it's going to get so warm, it's going to get so hot. So what we're not focusing on here is the critical question biologically is what is going to happen in the wintertime. Because we're going to have way more temperature change in the wintertime than we are in the summer. So I've seen ASF has described PEI as a cold water refugia for fish in the summertime for 100 years because it's not going to change so much in our streams. If you're going to 15.5 degrees average temperature during August, September, you're still pretty darn cold. So it's not going to bother a salmon or a brook trout. But in the wintertime, it's going to change by up to 4.5 degrees Celsius in the wintertime. So what's that going to mean? It's going to mean there's going to be a whole lot less snow and there's going to be more rain. That could actually even make the water colder because you have a big snowpack and you get a whole lot of rain on top of it. It actually creates supercooling in the water and it goes down to 0 degrees. So there's a whole lot of ramifications for the wintertime, but the summertime is not really the focus in terms of what's going on. So we've got all this pumping from Close Creek. What has actually happened in terms of measured discharge? And I use August here because August is most reliably the low flow month. It's not always the lowest flow month, but is most reliably low flow. September is a lot more variable. It can be the lowest month. Once it's even been October, but it can be quite up and down. But the least variability in terms of a low flow month is August. So we use August. We started in 2016, but we did find some data that was done for a consultant that took a whole lot of massaging. So we had a more of an extended period to calculate that Q50. This was the other problem with these metrics, is you actually have to have flow measurements on the stream to measure them for your regulations. And most streams in PEI are not, and Canada are not measured. So how do we know what the normal flow is in those streams? We don't. So yeah, we have regulations for flow that need to know that information. So we're able to calculate this. Pumping started about here. Since they've been pumping, they've been out of compliance with the 65 Q50 twice. 2020, very dry year, so, and 2022 was actually relatively dry as well, as was 2024. I don't have the point on here yet, but it's certainly going to be below the line in 2024 as well. So actually out of the 7 years or so that they've been pumping, they've been the stream has been out of compliance with the regulations 3 times. Now, to be, in reality, it probably would have been out of compliance in 2020, even without any pumping from that river, because the flows were so low that year. So what part of it is actually from the pumping, and what part of it is just normal variability? And you'll notice as well, there were some wildly high flow years in 2009, 2011. So I don't know why, but it happened all across the island from the flow records as well. So they're out of compliance with the regulations, and guess what? Probably nearly every well field that gets municipal water in PEI is more or less out of regulations at some years. So the problem in PEI is actually not going to be agricultural water, it's actually municipal water use that is the problem. We're pumping 24/7 all of this water into the ground for ourselves. So yet there was a whole lot of controversy and focus about agricultural irrigation, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the question became, well, how much is the pumping actually reducing the stream flow? And the only way we could think about figuring that out, because it's not an easy thing to do with all that variability, is compare a ratio of a nearby stream. We use the Springville branch of the North River with Lower Coles Creek before and after pumping. And so the downward translation of that line is a reduction in how much flow we expect to get out. So the province modeled this much before they started, and they figured it was at 66% of permitted, which they're above. It was going to be about 0.01 cubic meters per second. And we have observed an average of about 0.02 cubic meters per second reduction because of the Milton Vale well pumping. So not that far off the modeled amount, really. In fact, they're probably higher here, so they're probably closer than they look there. So the models, which is all we have for PEI most of the time, and the actual measure are telling us very similar things, which gives us some confidence in the models the province is using to predict how much water is going through the rivers. Of course, I just wanted to show you that we're also measuring temperature in all of those electrofishing reaches every single year as well, and there's a lot of variability in temperature as well. My concern was that with lower flow, you're going to get much higher temperatures because you don't have enough cooling water to come in. So the interesting thing is that that's only partly true. So in fact, in 2023, when we had the highest flows in recent record, we got some very, very warm stream temperatures. So the weather forcing variables are almost as important as the flows as well. So what do we know from the fish? Just had to show a cool picture to start with. So I mentioned earlier that the stream actually cools as you go downstream, which is not normal for a stream. And it's because unique to PEI is all the spring input into the stream. So we look at a drone image of the stream, and then we look at it in the thermal sense. So we can see in the wintertime, all of that warm water coming, all of that warm water is spring water. It's coming out of the ground at 7 degrees Celsius. So when the stream might be 2 or 4 degrees Celsius. So in the wintertime, springs warm the stream. So in the summertime, those springs are cooling the stream. So very, very important as to why we have such cold streams here is all that groundwater input into the stream. And Coles Creek is no different. So. Well, were there any more or less fish over the period of time after pumping? The short answer is no, just some young of the year brook trout densities. We did this with rainbow trout as well, and adult and brook trout as well. So and really there was a drop, but the drop wasn't consistent with when they started pumping. The drop was actually before they started pumping from the system, because they didn't really start to well into 2018 pumping, when these fish wouldn't have been affected by that already. So and it stayed pretty consistent, and there's been ups and downs. In fact, the biomass has gone up in recent years. Rainbow trout are a little more variable, but there hasn't appeared to be any consistent pre-post pumping pattern in the density or the actual numbers of fish that are in the stream. However, when we look at the growth of the young of the year fish, their size, what we find for an ecological study, and we have one more point which is probably going to agree pretty well with this, so an R-squared of 0.72, meaning 72% of the variation is explained in young of the year length or growth, our measure of growth, versus the minimum flow in that lower part of the system. Now for an ecological study over 8 years, that's actually a stunning relationship. So that it means the lower the flow grows, the less those fish grow. Why is that? So, well, brook trout, it's what they call a critical or a drift feeding hypothesis. It's not unknown that brook trout drift feeders, they sit there and wait for things to come by their nose basically to eat them. So the more water velocity is, the more invertebrates are being moved downstream, the more food they have. So, and when you couple that with the fact that your stream shrinks a little bit at lower flow, you have less habitat, so it's probably a combination of those factors. But it's a stunning relationship that says, okay. And in fact, when we get out of compliance is when we start to get the really low lengths, particularly those 2 years when we're out of compliance, and we're going to have a third one actually. So, there is definitely a significant effect when we're out of compliance. So, which suggests that those guidelines are somewhat protective. So, because we've gone below them is when we see the most effects, but not a big safety margin, but somewhat protective. So, interestingly, this is condition factor, which is how fat those young of the year are for their unit length. It's like a body mass index comparison of fish. And in fact, the condition factor is higher with higher temperature. So I'm still trying to get my head around that. So flow had no effect on the condition factor, but temperature did, whereas we tested both temperature and flow for the growth. Temperature had no effect, but flow did. So we definitely have something going on here. So in terms of the fish stuff in Coles Creek. But then we had to get bigger. So because, and this project, the second project, which now expands to the agricultural aspects, was talked about for many, many years. It took a lot of years to make it happen. So under the McLaughlin government, we talked about it a lot, and the election got there. And he wasn't going to do it during an election, and with the present government, so they moved a little more aggressively towards getting rid of the moratorium, which they eventually did. So initially the research was posed that we need to know this before we get rid of the moratorium. So well, that was a political decision anyway. So then they said, okay, no, we're just going to get rid of the moratorium. It'll take the pressure off you, so to get this research done. So, okay, so. But the trouble is the moratorium was about high capacity wells. It's not a scientific question. So if you put a 6-inch hole in the ground or you put an 8-inch hole in the ground, you can get more water out of an 8-inch hole. It's not a scientific question. So it doesn't tell me that's just knowledge. So it doesn't tell me what's going to happen with the stream. So, and what was happening, of course, is that there are a number of farmers, including one in our study, who was like punching holes in the ground everywhere like it was Swiss cheese. Low capacity wells. So if you got 6 low capacity wells and you got 1 high capacity well, what's the difference? So you're taking the same amount of water out of the ground. So the advantage of getting rid of the moratorium and proclaiming the Water Act is now at least they're trying to get, because it was the Wild West, so everybody drilling these low capacity wells, nobody needed, they were all doing it legally, so they didn't have to have them properly permitted. They will now within 5 years after the Water Act going in, even those low capacity wells will have to be permitted in the same way high capacity wells are. So they're actually measuring the total amount of flow coming out of the ground as opposed to worrying how big your pipe is. So a bigger pipe just means you can get a bigger pump in the ground. So and you can pump more water out of it. So the concept of deep water wells, well, that doesn't exist. So because in fact, most of the time, most of your water comes from the shallower part of the well. So to start with, the deeper you go, the less water you actually get. And they're all the same depth anyway. So there's no such thing as a deep water well. It's a total misnomer. So it's just a bigger pipe that you can get a bigger pump in and pump more water.
So what is the average depth then?
Average depth 308, so is usually what it's, a lot of the low capacity wells will be 250 feet, so 308 is typically so. Now in the world that's considered a shallow well. So in standards, so when you drill a well that's 2,000 feet, that's considered a deep well by world standards. When you drill a 308-foot well, that is a shallow well. So it's not a deep well by any standards at all. So they're not deep, and most of the water doesn't come from deep anyways, other than one place in PEI where we hit water. 90% of the water comes, a lot of times it was a waste of time to go to 308 feet, and a waste of money because there was no water down there. So it just gets tighter and tighter and tighter and less connectivity of water as you go down in most places. So we got this big NSERC Alliance grant with co-funding from the province, and the goal of the partnership with farmers and the province and government agencies is to quantify and optimize sustainability trade-offs associated with both agriculture and water use to improve environmental, economic, and social outcomes. Well, that's a lot of words, but we are studying environmental flows but we have many, many more dimensions that were really added because of what stakeholders wanted. So we had to go out and dig a lot of agricultural wells. So you can see the rig up there, John Manderson, so the hardest working man I've ever met. So he was our well driller. So I once got to the Dunk River at 7 in the morning. I got there. He said, "Yeah, I got one more rod to go." And I said, "You started last evening." I said, "What time did you get here?" So, oh, it started just 4 or 5. So the only man at PEI who runs a well rig all by himself. So yeah, no help whatsoever. So anyways, just put some holes in the ground for us, which is an interesting process. So no big surprise, you don't get water everywhere you put a hole in the ground. And it's a $30,000 hole you're putting in the ground. So it's not. So it's not like people are going to be drilling wells everywhere. In fact, I think, other than our study, I think really the only wells that have been drilled have been from Cavendish farms. So I'm not aware of any other permits for farmers that are not part of Cavendish proper, so that other than this study. So you're talking, this is a lot of money. In fact, half the money for the project is gone into this. So what do we want to look at? Well, along the same themes, we want to look about flows. So what methods should we use to define e-flows in the contracts of increased water abstraction and climate change? I'll talk about this a little more at the end because the biology is encompassed in there, but we have to kind of rethink the biology a little bit based on what we've done in Coles Creek. So, and of course we have my co-funded people from Andre, who's our modeler and our well-known hydrologist internationally, and Simon Courtney from Waterloo, who used to run the Canadian Water Networkers. The next question, which we didn't have in our previous Coles Creek study because all the groundwater monitoring is done by the province, was what groundwater tools or models best predict stream flow alterations due to groundwater extraction. And we're working with Yifeng Jiang, who was originally the provincial hydrogeologist and is now a hydrogeologist working across the road with AAFC. So an excellent modeler. So unfortunately, this is an area of study where I have been unable to find a single graduate student yet to work on this. So I've had a couple that applied and pulled out. Not one from Canada. Hydrogeologists are a very, very small group, so it's been very challenging. So being that the models is the all-important part of how the province regulates how much water is going to be taken out of a watershed, this is a very, very important part of the study as well. There were a lot of requests best to include soil aspects in it as well. So what are going to be the trade-offs? And there are some beneficial trade-offs of irrigating as well with regard to nutrients, which is probably the largest environmental problem on PEI. So this is a loading estimate we did with a study I did with Kerry McQuarrie at University of New Brunswick a number of years ago, actually, showing the immense loading of nutrients that PEI contributes to the regional area. So can irrigation combined with enhanced nutrient management actually increase nutrient use by the plants, reduce greenhouse emissions, and reduce nutrient loss? So in a lot of ways, adding water, the right amount of water, can make the system a whole lot more efficient and have other benefits downstream. And from a soil health perspective, can combining irrigation with other beneficial practices that promote increased organic matter, which will retain water, actually improve soil health as well. So. And Dave Burton at NSAC is the guy doing most of these parts. And finally, to cap it all off, we had to kind of tie it all together with some more general sustainability type research, evaluating sustainability in decision making and the trade-offs. This is the part that we thought of ourselves that nobody actually asked us to do, so, but it's quite important in terms of tying it all together. How do we best quantify the sustainability trade-offs given the range of economic, social, and environmental variables? Examining decisions of water use, and a lot of it has to do with utilizing a common pool of resource. Of course, the tragedy of the commons suggests that humans can never do that, whereas other people had suggested that we can actually successfully use common pool of resources without actually destroying the environment. So that's an overarching school of thought, and our own Joshua is here tonight as well, who's part of that and is now looking at some of the history of land use and water use in PEI to start off that part of the project. So, but that's growing quite nicely on part of the project. So, common pool of resources in Alberta, water is a common pool resource for irrigation. So the government pipes it to the farmers. So how do we deal with that here if we're taking water out of the ground, and how can the farmers share it? As a PEI specific example, so that everybody can benefit by the safe amount that we can take from the ground. So. Okay, where are we all doing this? So we were able to get a number of farms in this. Now, we didn't get water on all of these, so we basically got a potato farm up near O'Leary, so the only one in the western part of the island, another potato farm up near Baltic. So in the Dunk River, a bit of a different scenario in the Dunk River because we have farmers that surface water extract from the Dunk River, and the province very much wants them to go to taking groundwater rather than surface water. So that's a conversion near Emerald from going from surface water to groundwater. So of course, Coles Creek is still part of the ongoing study, even though it's municipal. We have an organic beet farm that isn't set up yet for irrigation yet, so in the Vernon River watershed. So we have a very large blueberry farm, so near Mount Stewart. So and we had another potato farm up near St. Peter's, and we didn't get enough water there, so that one probably won't be included. So for every watershed where we're taking water, we try to incorporate a paired watershed that we're also studying. Sometimes it's a sub-watershed, sometimes it's a nearby watershed. In the Pierre Jacques, we have the big Pierre Jacques and the little Pierre Jacques close together. We're looking at flow in both. One has irrigation, one doesn't. For example, in the Vernon River, we're able to look at two branches of the Vernon River, one where we'll have the irrigation and one where we don't. So again, we're still moving along with getting all these farms together. It took a whole heck of a lot longer than I would have anticipated. So in addition to, for each farm, in addition to two 94-meter deep or 385 deep production wells, we've had to establish an extensive groundwater level monitoring as well, which is actually really pricey as well. So what we've done is have a number of shallow wells, 3 shallow wells, about 50 meters from each of the production wells, which each have a flow meter on as well, so we know exactly how much the farmer takes. So we've also established a set of 3 wells very close together, where we screen off the top of 2 of them so that no water can get into that well. So what we're actually measuring there is the vertical conductivity of water in the ground. And quite often these lower wells, because of the hydraulic pressure, can have much higher levels than the shallow surface wells. So, in fact, sometimes they can even become artesian and push water out of them. So, very little known about that vertical conductivity of groundwater. So we also have level loggers with a conductivity detector in the production wells themselves. So when they're pumping, we can measure A, how far does the water level go down, and B, is there any incursion of saline water into that well. So we're able to do that. We don't have a lot of data to show you or any students to study it just yet. So I'm going to finish off, and I'm probably going to go a little longer than I'd hope, but this will be the finish off section anyway. So I'm going to talk about the biological monitoring component now, because now we're much bigger. Some things have changed. So we've changed from a single watershed to a regional scale. So there's no way we can do the intensity of study we did on Coles Creek at those sites off across Prince Edward Island. It's just not going to happen. So we don't want to just understand fishes. We never did. It's just that's what it had the resources to do. We want to understand biodiversity as a whole. It's hard and very hard and time-consuming thing to get at, which is why I'm going to discuss some of these new techniques. We do want to continue to focus on fish growth on a regional scale, but we have something to focus on. We don't have to measure everything. We don't have to do 12 electrofishing reaches for that. So we'll continue to look at that in more of a region-wide scale and try and explain it rather than one stream. We still have to do the hydraulics and habitat modeling we said we were going to do a long time ago. And we have challenges related to short-term or undetectable flow change as well. The reality is with some of these farms, if they're pumping out of the Dunk River for 15 days in August with with 10 times higher flow than Coles Creek does, we can't really detect much of a flow change. So we're measuring a biological response in response to something we can't really detect. So we're not always going to be able to detect a flow change in the river due to that pumping, and that's just the reality of it. In some systems we may with smaller streams, some systems we may not, so we're going to have to depend a lot on the volume. So we have other focuses that are a bit more broad and a bit more academic, really, and particularly looking at biodiversity, because biodiversity is getting so important in Canada. Country and most provinces have biodiversity strategies now, so in terms of knowing not just what's happening to the fish, but what's happening to all of biota, which sounds like a lot of work, except we've got this fancy new technique that we call environmental DNA. So where we can actually go out and detect from cellular debris or little bits of things or poop that's in the environment, we can actually detect and identify species from that residual DNA that's floating down every stream and in every system around the world, so by various means. So it allows us for a scale of monitoring that is unprecedented, so that we couldn't possibly do before. If we wanted to go count every bug in Coles Creek at one location, it's going to take some student 3 weeks just to sort all the samples. And then a special level of expertise, and I had a guy like that who's now a provincial freshwater biologist, surface water biologist, to be able to actually identify all those organisms as well. So it's usually time consuming, and that's just one spot. So with eDNA techniques, we can now do this on an incredible scale. I'm not going to get too much into the molecular biology, except to say that there's two techniques. There's barcoding and metabarcoding. So one technique, we want to be highly selective for a single species with our assay. And the other technique, we want to be kind of non-selective, because we want to figure out everything that's living there. Now, we typically do this within groups, like fish, invertebrates, mammals, for example. So 100% on what gene we target and the selection of what we call the primers, which are the things we use to express those genes in the PCR assay. So we can go either highly selective, we just want to bind to this species and none other, so we can measure this species, or we want to see everything that's there within a specific group. So, and I'm also going to talk about the barcoding, but we are getting into the metabarcoding. So how do we do this? Well, we go out and filter some water, so because all these little bits are in the water. So, and we actually got an eDNA sampler. We could filter in the lab, but we have to be so careful about contamination It's better to get the filter right in the water, so the water only goes through the filter, because the filter is actually held in the water in this little cup. So you wouldn't have noticed, but this is upside down, because Gracie Gallant, a student at the time, found it worked better upside down, so for priming. So, and the company has since changed the design of the instrument based on her observation. It just works better when I put it upside down. So a lot of upside down things can come from PEI. So we take this filter paper, we freeze it in ethanol, we bring it to the lab, and we extract the DNA. So we're able to go all across the island and get all kinds of samples. Remember, all we need is a filtered water sample. So no bugs, no nothing. So the first question is, well, we did all this electrofishing, so how can eDNA potentially tell us about fish numbers? So this is a $64,000 question in eDNA biology is, how can it be quantitative? So what my student did, who's actually right now was working on maps in the lab when I was in there, is we went out, we did our usual electrofishing reaches, and 2 reaches in each of those streams. So we collect stream flow and width data, measure all the salmonids as we usually do. The samples she collected for this particular study were actually in 21 and 22. Kind of partially in 22, we had this issue of hurricane blowing trees in the stream everywhere. We had to spend a month and a half with chainsaws cutting our electrofishing reaches out. But we did get 77 data sets over the 2 years from electrofishing. So and what she basically found is that there is a significant relationship between the copies of eDNA and the number of individuals. Now this is uncorrected. We know that flow in a stream is a modifying variable of this, so this relationship or this model will likely improve. So the end result is, yes, we can, in a reasonable sense, get an estimate of the number of fish from environmental DNA. It can be quantitative, so it's not going to be super good, but we can use it as a quantitative technique. We can learn about invasive species. So I had a PhD student a number of years ago, Scott Rollison, who now working for DFO, did a whole bunch of stuff on rainbow trout and interactions with salmon on PEI. So we decided we'd go out with eDNA and look at New Brunswick and PEI at quite a number of sites. There were no rainbow trout detections actually in these New Brunswick or Nova Scotia sites. So I'm just going to show our revised PEI map with eDNA. So everywhere where we knew there were rainbow trout to be, except for Murray River, which we didn't detect it, even though we know they're there. But every other one where we knew rainbow trout to be, the red ones, we found rainbow trout. But we also, with eDNA, we found rainbow trout DNA in a number of streams. We did a bunch more up here too that I don't think are shown. We did eDNA, a found eDNA in a bunch of streams from rainbow trout where they're not really known, and some of these have been actually confirmed, like most one of interest is North Lake Creek, because it's a vital salmon stream, so and it now has rainbow trout in it. So we have actually detected them there in our fall water fishing, and we detected eDNA there as well. So it's a very good way to detect these invasive species as well. So now I'm going to switch to something that's kind of cool. So 6 years ago, I knew nothing about freshwater mussels. So actually, a lot of the impetus of this came from Rosemary Curley. So now a private naturalist, but who used to work for the wildlife in the province as well. So is looking at these status of these species of freshwater mussels in PEI. So I didn't realize how many there were even. So most freshwater mussels have a swimming stage called the lochidia, which attaches to the gills of fish. So in their early life stages, and then they eventually fall off and become what we know as mussels in the bottom. So, and they're very specific about the fish they like as well. So for example, the eastern pearl shell is only known to parasitize Atlantic salmon, so which is fascinating. So there are a few species that could potentially be here. The eastern floater, which is thought to be on three-spined stickleback. Nobody knows for sure sometimes. It's a very common species on PEI. The alewife floater, very rare species on PEI. The eastern pearl shell, a relatively rare species. And the brook floater, which is a threatened species in New Brunswick, and its existence was not known on PEI. Nobody has ever seen it yet, and it's thought to be on the slimy spot. So it was actually Gracie that did this. So along with the citizen science record, she measured eDNA in a whole bunch of streams, all of which are colored. A lot of them were negative, and in fact, most of the places where citizen science found them, we were able to detect them with eDNA. So what is really interesting is that we also detected eDNA in the Bear River, and they were not known to be in the Bear River. So we did discover a new population of eastern pearl shell mussels. And this is how sensitive the techniques are. We went out with 5 people, spend the better part of a day looking to verify the presence of eastern pearl shell mussel in about a kilometer to a kilometer and a half of stream, and we found 2 of them. That's how few there were. Yet we could detect their presence with environmental DNA. So it's so exquisitely sensitive. So you'll notice as well, and I'm going to talk about this, is that there seems to be kind of a concentration here around St. Peter's Bay. So we scratched our heads for a little bit of time. So we know the species is associated with salmon. So it does actually exist in some places where there are no longer salmon, such as Enmore. There's still eastern pearl shell, even though there's no salmon. But the species of mussel can live for 100 years. So it just means there were salmon there in the last 100 years. So most rivers where we still have salmon, particularly those around St. Peter's Bay, we seem to have eastern pearl shell mussels, and a couple others which there are no salmon, but there has been the presence of salmon over time. So we scratched our heads about, well, environmental effects and sediment on PEI and how they're affecting these mussels. And then we kind of realized we weren't really looking in the right historical time frame. We needed to be looking more like 13,000 years ago. So, and what was happening 13,000 years ago? Well, the last big chunk of ice in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence was sitting right over the island by the most recent estimates, which are published. So as this bit of ice receded, and I've overlain here the brown, and the brown is actually called fluvial pathways. It's from the Vanderpulse Official Geology of PEI, which is an amazing piece of work done in the 80s, and we have maps of this. These are where the existing stream beds are, but it shows the fluvial drainage network of that last part of the glacier, which was probably about here, and all of those brown streams you see, including a number of lakes. St. Peter's Bay was actually St. Peter's Lake because it was a glacial formed lake. So all of those fluvial pathways are shown there, and it can still be seen in the superficial geology, which probably explains why we have this biodiversity in this area around St. Peter's Bay, is because it had this more recent great fluvial glacial drainage network that was colonized by Atlantic salmon, which probably brought, and other fishes, which probably brought that parasite with them. So, yeah, we don't see the eastern pearl shell mussel on the far eastern part, even though there's lots of Atlantic salmon there. None. There are none in those systems like North Lake Creek and Cross River. But it came out of the ice first and it wasn't joined up. So they may have been different colonization events. And we have genetic data to support that, actually, that there were 2 different colonizations in this part. And one of them brought the mussels and one of them didn't. So the reason the mussels are there is because they came here 10,000 years ago and not to other places. And it's still that way. Ale white floater, again, there was 1 record of ale white floater in the Morel River, and Gracie was able to find a 2nd record in DeRoche Pond, which has a lot of eastern floaters, so you would have to sort through about 1,000 eastern floaters probably to find an ale white floater, because they look very similar too. So the eDNA was able to detect that 2nd population, but again, it's around the St. Peter's Bay area. Now the brook floater, we looked at all of these sites. The map is misleading, the green and the other ones for brook floater. We could not find any sign of brook floater on PEI, so no brook floater detected. So we had a positive control site in the Petitcodiac, which is known to have them, and we did detect them. So the assay works. What is interesting is the slimy sculpin. The reason we looked for brook floaters because we knew there were slimy sculpin in now 5 small watersheds in western PEI, so it's only a little fish. So why are they there? So it had always been assumed for years somebody brought them as bait fish or something like that. But we started to realize that distribution matches the New Brunswick side. So it was probably the tail end of the post-glacial migration of So, because PEI was joined by land and fresh water to the mainland. So this freshwater fish was actually able to migrate all the way from its glacial refugia, and it's only in western PEI for that reason. So we found with eDNA, we found a couple of extra watersheds where they weren't known before. So those are actually also a vestige of something that happened 8,000 years ago in terms of that migration, and then PEI became an island, and they got isolated, but again, no brook floater, so that's okay. So that's just sort of a little snippet of the biology work which we were able to start before some of the other work that is well developed, so we don't have a lot of conclusions from that yet, but in fact we're just getting some new students hopefully starting in January that we'll be looking at using metabarcoding for invertebrates and fishes, so we can get, just looking at mussels here, we can get a whole lot better picture of what the biodiversity is in PEI streams. We have some related projects as well. We have an eDNA project looking for river otter because, of course, they've been reintroduced to PEI as well in combination with some of Gary Gregory's trail cameras that he has set up to detect river otter, particularly around the Kensington area. So we'll be expanding a whole lot broader and trying to understand the biodiversity of PEI. Why is that important to flows? Well, there's a little thing in the Water Act where, and it's totally unexplored, where we can designate watersheds or regions for particular purposes. So, and we could designate regions for environmental protection. So if somebody ever used those aspects of the Water Act. So source water protection is in there. If you have a watershed where the city is taking water for the city of Charlottetown, you can protect that watershed and say, okay, nobody else is pumping there because that's important for the city of Charlottetown. We could potentially say, this is an ecologically important area and we don't want anybody pumping here. So, not impossible, maybe it's a work of fiction in my mind, but under the Water Act it's possible. And every time I mention that part of the Water Act, they go like this, and it's like, because they haven't really thought about it yet. And the reality is that Water Acts, take about a decade to work in from the experience in BC before they're really able to kind of utilize and enact all the parts of the act. So the biodiversity becomes very important as to what do we want to protect. So, we could potentially protect certain areas from water being taken and say, okay, this area doesn't have a lot of biodiversity, so let's have a trade-off here. Farmers can use more water to irrigate here. So these are questions we're going to have to ask in the future of ourselves. So we're trying to provide the biology behind that. So. And of course, there's a whole lot of students and other people that have been involved in all this that I stole slides from and threw together. So welcome to entertain any questions that I can answer.
I was wondering if there's any research done on the salt water coming into wells, or how near the coast have to be before that happens.
As we said, we thought about that, and we have salinity detectors in the production well, which is most likely to get salt water socked in first. I actually have to look at that data, but the wells we had that were closest to salt water were the ones in St. Peter's. Baltic is as well. So, but at 308 feet, you'd have to be really, really close to salt water or be a complete fluke, I would think, to get any salt water intrusion into those wells. It's pretty unlikely. You pretty much would have to be right on the coast. And even then, I don't know at a relatively shallow 308 feet whether you're going to get that. So you might have to go a little bit deeper to get that. So I would say the probability is really low, though I wouldn't exclude it, being a rarely occurring thing in some cases.
You mentioned that not every place you go down to get water will, never heard of. What areas can you not get water in?
Well, and that's why the site up west is very important, because geologically it's, even though it kind of looks all the same, it's quite different in terms of the movement of water through the substrate, and that's because it's a lot of siltstone. There's very little fracturing, of course. You need to move water on PEI. You need fracturing of the sandstone. There's very little fracturing. It's very flat. It's siltstone, so it's very impervious. So the only reason we can get good wells is because water is able to move through those fractures into the well. Now, near Emerald, in the Duck River, so I close my eyes and put my finger in a spot in the ground and we drill a hole, we're going to get 500 gallons a minute out of it. So it's just the fracturing of the sandstone there is such that it just seems to be abundant amounts of water. But we drilled 2 up west initially, and we got next to nothing, 50 out of one and 80 out of the other, like, you know, lower than your household well probably. So we found a little spot in a dip where we drilled, and we were able to hit water. That's the only place we hit water deeper is there. So, but again, you can walk 50 yards away and drill a well, and another 50, and one can have water and one can't. If you happen to hit a fractured area, and it can be a patchwork, so, and there's no real way to tell. So yeah, so we had some good areas and some bad areas, but up west where there's not a lot of high capacity wells, so Old Erie is the only other one, you know, your probability is much lower than you're going to get water. So the well driller told me he drilled one for Cavendish, and he said, no, I wouldn't drill there, no, we want a well there, and he got 5 gallons a minute. You can almost get as much out of your bathtub tap, so as he was able to get. So.
Do we have any data on where wells go dry on PEI, or is it just anecdotal?
I would imagine it'd be pretty anecdotal unless the province is, you know, getting something that they're reporting. So yeah. So
I was thinking of your Milton Vale fields, because everybody there was on well water, and now they're.
well, it's recent enough that if that had started to happen, I think we would have heard something about it, but I've never heard of tell of anybody. And the reality is, in these really good producing areas, you know, I mean, we know something of the groundwater, water table depression because we have monitoring wells. So probably, you know, and the water kind of goes down like this and towards the well, and you get that water level come down. Most of we have a hydrologist working with the well driller doing all the hydrology estimates on these wells, and you know, the distance of influence. It's typically less than 250 meters. So whereas basically if you go past 250 meters, you're not going to get any influence on your groundwater level. So that it's a pretty small radius where you would expect that. Now, having said that, water can do funny things as well. So we had, when Kyle did his master's, we had springs in the forest in Surrey, you know, that had nitrate in them. It's like, where did that come from? There's not a farm within a kilometer, right? So there's always possibilities, but in general, that cone of depression is the word for it, has about a 250 meter radius.
Just a comment on drought. You indicated it's not a worry for Prince Edward Island, but in the news this last week, there's been situations in Nova Scotia, and the story implied that it was beyond Nova Scotia, including some of the other maritime provinces.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, how is the issue, how can we talk about drought if you're saying that it isn't really a concern for the province?
Well, I don't know that it's not a concern. I don't believe that anybody can say for sure one way or the other. So, which means it might be a concern or it might not be a concern, but I don't believe anybody can predict it that I would have any confidence in whatsoever. So yeah, we can't predict the weather in a week. So there are climate scenarios we don't understand. So yes, it could happen. Is it happening now? So I actually analyzed PEI data, and there's no evidence that it's happening in the last 50 to 100 years. So we certainly get periods of dry, and same with snow, right? So you know, look at snowfall. There's actually, I don't know why, but NOAA has a data set for Charlottetown. It goes back 100 years. You know, occasionally I look at these data and I go, what's going on here? It's like, nothing. Nothing is going on here. It's 100 years of data. You can see it, I can see it, anybody can see that. Yeah, we had a big snowfall in 2014, 2015. You know what? It happened before. 50 years ago or 100 years ago, it happened before. It's a 50 or 100 year snowfall, but it happened before. So you know, can't say there's a trend there.
Using the dunk again as an example, and the change in emphasis on agricultural irrigation from
Groundwater, yeah.
What's driving that?
What's driving that is if you take 800 gallons a minute out of a stream, you're going to reduce that stream flow by 800 gallons a minute. So if you take 800 gallons a minute out of the ground, you're not going to reduce that stream flow by 800 gallons a minute, because not all of that water down there would have ever got to that stream. A huge amount of our groundwater actually comes out in salt water, out in the Strait, or out in the Gulf. So a lot of that water goes and comes out not on land. So you have a bigger pool of resources of water there that you can take, because it's without affecting the stream.
Well, you're basically deferring the impact.
Well, you're moving it, yeah, whatever the impact, what is going to be the impact of less water coming out in the Strait, you know.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe not very much, maybe it will be, I don't know. So yes, you're changing, in terms of the amount of fresh water coming out, you're changing the location of the impact. It's not going to be right at your stream, but it will be. So, but on the other hand, you know that what water does come in is important for cooling our streams. So the temperature effect should not be ignored. So if you're pumping 800 gallons a minute out of a stream, you're not actually changing the temperature of that stream. It's still the same temperature. Now it may warm a little faster further downstream, so because there's less water. So, but if you're taking it 7-degree water out of the ground and you're removing water from coming into the stream, you are modifying the temperature of that stream.
Now, do you think that can be reflected once the permits are being allocated?
Well, I mean, I would like to see them use the 70 Q50 for groundwater and make it a little more stringent. So if you made it much more stringent, again, you'd certainly, from what we've seen from the data, you'd be in the territory where you're just out of compliance every year anyway. So just because of, there's a lot of natural variability in flow here. And again, we got 60-year-long records, right? It's just, it's incredible when you look at a particular month. It's just like.
But do you think that, back in the biodiversity component, do you think that that can have a practical place in the administration of, say, environmental flows?
I think it can if we decide to go with protected areas because of their biodiversity.
So to designate.
You designate watersheds, and it's not even explicit in the Water Act. It just says regions, I think. Is that a watershed, or is that a group of watersheds? Is that a region? So it's not explicit in the Act, but the possibility is in the Act that you could designate regions for protection. Again, they don't talk about it.
But do you think that the foundation is there within the structure of the Water Act?
I believe so, yes. So, but you would, again, acts are only a kind of a framework, really. So there's a reason we write a lot of regulation, because regulations are easier to change. But to make it work, you would probably have to write a regulation around that for how you're going to do that. Because it doesn't say so in the Water Act, it just opens the possibility that you can do this.
But as you stated, there are gaping holes in the Water Act as it stands now.
Well, for sure, there are at least things that nobody has thought about how they're going to implement yet. And some of that is resources too. They just don't have the people or the time to make this all happen. So and it's kind of gone off the radar. So and part of the reason it's gone off the radar is actually climate change. It's become such the big all-encompassing topic of the century that we're forgetting about all the stuff that we could actually do things about to improve our environment. So unfortunately, so we need to shift a little bit, but politicians love that, because you can say I'm doing all this stuff about climate change and nobody can ever measure it, right? So that's the reality. It's like, look at all the stuff we're doing. So yeah, how do you measure the effect of that? You can't. So, but nutrient reduction, or protecting our flows in the stream. These are things you can do stuff about and you can measure them. So.
But the data that you're providing now is brand new data.
Oh yeah, so, and it's, it's a drop in the bucket too, in terms of, what we really need to understand for all of PEI to protect things as well, but at least we're starting and we're heading in the right direction, I think.
We're totally dependent on the modeling of this.
Well, the modeling is very important, so, and realistically, we will always be dependent on the modeling, so, because we simply can't go out and measure everything. So it's logistically impossible, so, but it would be nice to have confidence in the modeling, so to do the studies to give us confidence. Like for instance, the model we use is called a porous flow model. So it assumes that PEI is a big bed of sand that water can move through freely, and it moves through freely in every direction in every possible way. Well, PEI isn't like that. So, but that porous flow model approximates a very fractured watershed, because a very fractured watershed, water can move up and down and pretty easily too. So, but it may not approximate a watershed in Western PEI that is not very fractured, where water doesn't move. It may be the wrong model. We just don't know. So, so these are the sorts of questions we want to ask for that, and unfortunately that is the important part of the project that is not very well developed yet, because we just can't find bodies. So, I can hardly find a Canadian student anymore that wants to do grad work in any area, actually, so I'm bringing one from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Iran, hopefully next year, right? Then nobody wants to do grad work, so excellent students that, no, don't want to do grad work, so can't afford to do that, so it's like you can't afford not to do it these days, which just can't.
You mentioned that Canada probably want to switch irrigation from surface water to groundwater. Like, what's the difference between irrigation from surface water and just because of biodiversity?
Well, the province wants everybody to switch. There's about, I think, 28 surface water permits, and they'd like to see them all go away, I think. So, again, it's just you have a bigger pool of water if you're taking groundwater than taking from the stream, so that you can potentially take some. And also, you're not going to suck fish right out of the stream either, which I'm sure they do. So.
And other things.
Yeah, and other things, yes.
I'm still about the biodiversity component of it, and the impact of environmental flow on biodiversity.
Well, again, and that's probably because we may not be able to measure that necessarily. So, but just because you can't measure the impact doesn't mean you can't take actions to protect it if you have areas of concern for biodiversity, you know. So, I mean, there's some of our best, even fisheries, not just biodiversity, some of our best Atlantic salmon rivers are up in, in eastern PEI. I could, up north of Surrey on the North Shore there, I could very easily see them wanting to say, okay, we want to protect these rivers. We do not want any water abstraction in these rivers, just to protect salmon, right? So, so it's not a matter of necessarily showing that, there's a relationship between reduced flows. It's a matter of discovering what there is to protect that we have here as well, which is important. So, yeah, because I can't answer all the questions. I'm not going to be able to relate biodiversity necessarily to some farmer pumping out of 2 fields in a particular watershed. It's unlikely. It was always unlikely that I was going to be able to, answer that question with science. So some things you just can't measure. So.
After just coming back from the Caribbean, and some of the islands there have lost their water and can't use it. I'm just wondering, with our growth and population and cruise ships coming in taking the water, is there a possibility that we're not sustainable in our water?
Well, it is certainly the biggest threat to our water. So again, our human usage in cities is the biggest use of our water. So no question about it. However, and while it has been slow to come, so we've got a long way with water conservation strategies. And the city of Charlottetown has rolled out a lot of stuff, again, far too slowly in my mind, but they have done it to the point where we have actually seen one of the most tremendous population increases in recent history in the city of Charlottetown. Yet our water usage is flat. So it has remained flat, and that is the water, it's not improving the situation, but it has at least held it constant, so we're getting this bigger demand. And the cruise ship aspect, that's a drop in the bucket of water usage on the PEI. So it's not, we'd have to have a pretty big harbor to have enough cruise ships to even make a dent in our water consumption. So the general tourists that drive into the island would use hundreds of times more water than people coming off the cruise ships. So it's just easy to see the cruise ships and ask that question, but it really doesn't factor that significantly in our water use. So the number of people on the other hand does. So, and that summertime, you can see that summertime surge and that affects it as well. So yeah, we can increase our water conservation measures, though we're not there yet either. So in terms of water conservation in cities and things, so we could certainly be done. So there's room for improvement. So I think we can still remain sustainable, and we're only pulling water out of 2 major watersheds. So the reality is, even if we wanted to be in compliance with the current regulations, we would probably need another well field for Charlottetown anyway. So, but that's not in the planning as far as I know. So you can take water from somewhere else, and still and help everything stay in compliance. So, the same with other cities.
Has the city reduced the amount of water they're taking from the Winter River now that the Milton?
Oh, yes.
No.
Yes, very, very, very substantially. So yeah, everything you see coming out of that Miltonville well field, 6,000 cubic meters per day, is no longer coming out of the Winter River. So they've dropped that down very substantially.
What was it, Stratford? I don't even know where they get their water.
Well, that's coming from Charlottetown too, I believe. I'd have to check on that. I don't absolutely quote me on that, so because I don't think they have their own system of welfares, but I'd have to check on that. Maybe they do. So, good question. So, I thought about that.
It's the fastest growing community anyway. So.
Well, that's true too. So yes, but yeah.
They don't already, then you need to be looking for welfares.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You talked briefly about saltwater intrusion and
Mm-hmm.
the risk to that, but I'm wondering with, certainly would be many years down the road, but with sea level rise, where the wells are being placed, is that something that is going to be looked at? I'm wondering, or should it be something that we should be factoring in?
Not as big an issue as the Cows Creamery on the Causeway. I drive there all the time, and that's a meter above sea level.
Yeah,
it's like, what were they doing? So, where did all this climate change and planning and adaptation? It's like they're building something new again there. It's just like, really? So, it's in most of the wells, it's not. I mean, even the ones that are close to the coast, possibility. So for sure, but there won't be a lot of those. So you don't have to go uphill very far to quite often. So. Be out of the range of any danger there. So.
Maybe just a concern related to that, it was just the sheer amount of development that's happening at the coast. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. At the Death Swirl, there's a lot of force pushing that bubble of fresh water out as well. So you need a lot of sea level change too. But no, it's I know the Barrett Kirlick from Halifax, from Dalhousie, I've seen him show some graphs where, yes, you will get more, saltwater incursion into groundwater as the coast as the sea level rises. So, but it's a matter of how much, I guess, and how soon and how that's going to affect it.
Every once in a while, the provincial government talks about lifting the special planning area restrictions, which are sort of border around Charlottetown, Stratford, Cornwall, and then around Somerset. They were put in long ago. And so right now you can't do very much except expand things or build small things. And I wonder if opening up an area where development has been restricted for a really long time, whether or not it's within a municipality, would have a lot of impact on the groundwater levels, simply because it's a lot of household use, but it's many wells, very low capacity, but it's that number.
Certainly, there is some influence. Typically those sorts of areas have pretty big properties too, so how much the density of properties would influence that. You could rule out that there would certainly be some influence. So, though I suspect there'll be more and more pushback to, mean, it's really agricultural land protection now. It is going to limit cities, and, you know, it's been the same in other places like Ontario and the Niagara region and stuff like that, where they've really had to, you know, firmly say, no, you will not take any more farmland. So there's going to be push to and fro there in terms of opening up that land anyways.
What's your hopeful timeline for getting this all completed?
I don't know, I might retire first. So,
It's a
well,
lot.
20 years is
It
of
is
next
lots
year,
of
so it's never completed, so it's science. So, but
This particular
really
project.
for the bigger project, 2028. So, but you know, will all parts of it be complete? Probably not. And if I'm still working, I can see taking those parts that maybe the province wants to continue to fund. So, and also there's been a whole lot of reasons. Well, actually, I hope it won't be. I hope there'll be others to replace me that will use it, because now you've spent millions of dollars setting up basically these research farms. So, you know, and stream monitoring. So there's potential for it to be monitored for, you know, for 20 years or 30 years or more, or to use these for a whole lot of different things as well. So I would hope that it never actually ends, but you know, this project is probably going to be done in 2028, 2027, but we'll get an extra year quite likely. So we lost almost a year with hurricanes and strikes and things like that anyway. So yeah.
On that timeline question, would probably ask you this privately, but if you want to reflect in front of the group on it, what are the solutions to the personnel problem? Just why is it not appealing for graduate students anymore to join these teams?
Well, I know Gracie was up there, she's outstanding, you know, so I I practically begged her, you know, but she wanted to take a part-time job with the province, because she wanted to get it, it's all about money, so, you know, they just don't see the purpose in it anymore, and I don't think we've done a really good job either in terms of, you know, of the ones we teach as undergrads, a very small proportion of them actually want to be biologists. So they want to be, everybody wants, you know, a career. They want to be a dentist and a vet or a doctor. So a huge majority of ones were teaching undergrad biologists wanting to go into the biomedical and careers and stuff like that. And, you know, they don't really understand what they can do with a biology career. In fact, I've got a lot of students that are very gainfully employed at excellent jobs in PEI and all over the place. So there are huge careers, particularly in environmental biology, but they don't understand, and then they look, oh, I got to get a master's and a PhD, and, you know, it's a long time in school, it's a lot of money, I want to make money now. So there are a lot of life decisions, and like, you know, tell them, but people from overseas are coming because they come from places where, well, things aren't so good. So, and they have this huge opportunity to work really, really hard. And, you know, I keep saying, I said, well, the lab's filling up with all these overseas people, and guess what? They're going to be your boss, unless you do some graduate degree. So, and that's the reality of it. They're incredibly motivated and hardworking, and, you know, it's, you know, and we're not so much anymore.
And I guess kind of tied to that is, please help me here. With our water usage,
Yeah.
it's probably fair to say there's a big draw on the industrial side. Whether it's farming, what have you.
Not so much on PEI, but elsewhere, yes. So
Also, but PEI, not too bad.
not too bad, no. So it's mostly municipal here, but I mean, we don't have, in terms of industry, we don't have a huge water draw industries like pulp and paper mills, you know, 50,000 cubic meters a day for every pulp and paper mill, right? So we don't have big, really, really heavy water users like that. So, I mean, in the agricultural, it hasn't, I mean, it's going to increase, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to municipal. It's nothing now. So yeah. So I mean, there's small industry, which would, but it might be hard to tease that apart too from, you know, it's in Charlottetown or whatever. What's actually, maybe the city can do that actually, because they probably do have different water use, you know, permits or requirements. So how much of it is actually going to small industry and stuff? It would be appreciable, I would imagine, but not, you know. Grow operations and things like that are obviously using a bit of water, so and things like that. So, yeah, in PEI it's mostly people, so. The province did breakdowns of all this too, with the Water Act consultations and stuff like that, I just don't have them on the top of my head.
Yeah, because it's a thing where, let's face it, for us to be able to do this thing, it's going to take teamwork.
Oh, yeah.
Cooperation,
Mhm.
municipal, provincial, federal, and with corporations.
Mhm.
And where my mind goes is, as you said, other parts of the world, where you're like, you know, their islands, where are they ever going to, they're surrounded by water, so why are they going to end up with no potable water?
Mhm.
Is it a scenario for us? As you said, who would ever know? So that where my mind goes is the question, what if? So we'll go back to like political scenarios we never thought would happen, and all of a sudden, people are going, oh.
Speaking of anything in particular?
And then all of a sudden we get into water, so all of a sudden you get a phone call at 8 o'clock at night. So by the way, what do you know about water and how do we fix this? So that's kind of where that center of expertise, as you said, it's even harder to get these people to do that. I'm rooting for him.
Yeah, we're probably very fortunate on PEI. We do have a good resource in the small population. We're probably pretty safe, but I mean, there's been talks of the old Diefenbaker plan of rerouting water to California recently as well, right? So, from the Great Lakes, and there's, you know, crazy people are talking seriously about stuff like this now. So yeah, there's bigger problems out there than PEI has for sure. So, with regard to water, I mean, water is, you know, I mean, it's a lot of focus on climate, but really water is the real topic of the century around the world. So, as far as I'm concerned, and I would say that, of course, but
Water quality as well too. So
quantity, quality.
That is a concern.
Yes, yeah, and again, we're fortunate that, you know, we have a lot of regulations affecting water quality, although we have very weak nutrient regulations in Canada, so in particular, so, but we do generally have a lot of regulations that protect our water, and it's not like that everywhere either, so.
Anecdotally, uncles, older generation, I never had to get a water lamp in my, well, things are fine, and all of a sudden, you look and go, so how's that lamp going? You know, kill the bacteria, they're finding more and more, but.
Well, actually, interestingly, I had to get one too, but although it never bothered me, because the seal in my well broke, and still got to get the well driller out, see if we can fix that, it's not so easy, but the seal broke, and there are low levels of coliforms in there, which had never bothered me, but it does bother my wife, so, but I have no nitrate in my well, I have no agricultural influence in that well, it's just coliforms from the soil, so they were always there in wells all across PEI, always. They're not fecal coliforms, they're just soil bacteria, so, and they, you know, kind of, you know, squirrel poops up there, and who knows, right? So, so they've always been there, so not so much E. coli or fecal coliforms, the really bad ones, you know, that's more associated with agriculture, but I have no agricultural influence yet. I have coliforms in, and the lamps don't work for the shit, so. Do you have a question?
It's more of a comment, and so I appreciate your presentation tonight. It was informative, especially for me. I'm new to PEI relatively. We moved here from Alberta about a year and a half ago, and I served in the public service there for 27 years, and specifically in water management. So I was particularly interested to come and hear what you had to say. Having been an educator and a regulator of water for that many years, I think that PEI has a unique opportunity because your population is relatively small. I think there's a real opportunity here to get out ahead of what could be coming down, could be a new reality for the people on the island. And I hear lots of chatter about new people coming and doctors being, you know, there's a shortage of doctors. But my mind, obviously because of my background, goes to water management. And you brought up industry. I've heard mention of municipalities. I've heard the new Water Act and, you know, licensing, and that's my world. But I think that it's really a great opportunity to focus on water management and collection of data, because in the end, as regulators, they rely heavily, or will in the future, water management, watershed groups, things like that, rely on data to make decisions about, not only water quantity, but water quality. So.
And I'm glad you comment on that, actually, because that is something that, especially the part that Josh is part of with regard to those management aspects, which was, that part of the project was meant to address that stuff and how we could get ahead of it and how we could do things differently. I mean, for example, BC pretty much established the first in policy where you would have water, and okay, we run out of water, then nobody else has water. On PEI, they've publicly said very different, that now they haven't done it yet. They've said, we don't want to do it that way. We want to make sure that everybody who needs water can get water. So we want more of a sharing of that pooled resource. Now, how they actually accomplish that and the mechanism of doing it, but it's a very different philosophy that other places have taken in terms of that. So being sort of at the forefront of that and being able to have those discussions and talk about it is hopefully the research can be involved in how this develops in PEI. So we probably need about 50 more of us doing the research. We're spread a little thin, so it seems.
I think we will leave the rest of the questions to anyone who would like to chat with Mike one-on-one. I see some people who actually need to leave in the audience, and they're going to wait till the...
I could talk longer, though I'd probably have to go get my bottle of whiskey from the car if I did. Then I'd never shut up. So.
But thank you so much. That was a lot of plain languaging of things that many people here probably find difficult to wrap their heads around. Here is a little thank you. If you already have the Island Studies book in here, you're welcome to exchange it. It's our latest one, and the author is
not this one.
The author is in the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Tristan for recording stuff. And our next lecture is December 10th by an Island Studies graduate, Marlene Chapman. It's same location, same place, and she's going to be talking about how adaptive the lobster fishery on PEI is to climate change in relation to social structures. So welcome to come, and the recording for this lecture, as with all our lectures, will be online in a few days. Thank you.